that's where I think we are. Okay, it's family law. It's March 28th. We're in the final stretch, I believe, now of the semester, right? That's good and bad. I hope that it's more good than bad. Over the weekend, I gave you the last 3 assignments and the course project, and the quiz 3 is due today. If you haven't already done it, I think you have it till midnight tonight. So the other thing that we'll have in terms of testing will be the final exam, which is a cumulative exam. I'll tell you more about the format. I haven't totally decided the format of it yet, but we will figure out something.
It's not the time.
We'll see, maybe.
Well, can we have more than an hour and 15 minutes for that one?
Yeah. Why need more than an hour and 15 minutes? Yeah, you get 2 hours for finals,
Good.
typically. Why, was this one too tight of timing?
Yeah. Say that.
Okay. Well, we'll see how that worked out then. Sometimes have given you more than an hour and 15 on some of these.
Yeah, I know, and then you like bumped it down to 1 hour and 15.
Well, that's how long we would have if we took it in person, right? I didn't even give you an assignment over spring break. You could have been all prepared for the test.
Technically, you gave us 3 in the quiz and a course project over spring break.
Not all due over spring break.
Yeah, but it was enough to make us think they were going to give us a small heart attack.
Well, the syllabus still says when they were due. We can move on beyond those complaints, okay? I gave you all of them. Yeah, I know. The timer still goes when you close it because that way you could get all the answers and it's not really a timed exam. I didn't put the thing up, so you don't know what I'm talking about. Brian said, I don't like how the time keeps going if I close it. Well, it does that because otherwise it's not really a timed test. You could screenshot that sucker and then look up all the answers and it wouldn't really be timed, right? I understand. That's sometimes. Well, of course, Brian didn't say chasing them around. See what he said you have to do that makes it difficult. And I can't argue with you on that one either. So, good point. Noted. So I gave you the final project. Basically, the reason I gave you all the assignments all at once and I gave you the project is so that we can finish up you can work on those as you want. You can kind of get an idea. Some of the concepts, what I was going to tell you today is that as we go through at this point in the course, we're moving out of that divorce, child support, custody part of this of the subject matter of law family law, and into some of the other, I'll call them fringe, but not unimportant by any stretch, but the more fringe areas of family law, because lots of things fit into this in this area. What we know of family law typically is the dirty parts are divorce and family and custody and property distribution. A lot of what we're going to talk about at this point kind of goes a little bit to the other end and relates to familial rights, maybe is another way to look at it. And so with that said, you have those assignments. You can look them up. They're mostly research assignments, so you could probably knock them out early if you really felt like it. We will be tested over these final chapters that we're going to work on. And the project is basically you're going to put together some kind of a handbook for people who are looking to get some more answers to family law cases, particularly divorce. What would they do to resolve their divorce? Okay, you're trying to make a legal information pamphlet, maybe is another way to look at it, where you could go look and say, what do I do? I need to get divorced for whatever reason. What would happen? How would I go about doing that? So that's what you're asked to do in your final project. It gives you a scenario that you're going to use in that project. And I don't know how long it'll be. It just depends on what kind of information you think you would want to know if you had to file for divorce, okay? a more generalized, we're not arguing a case, we're just kind of compiling the information, but we need to make it easy to read and so that people who don't know much about this area would be able to follow. Okay? With that said, I'll tell you that there are a decent amount of self-help forums and things on the internet. So particularly in West Virginia, we have a lot of available resources. You need to tie those together and not just cite to them, but give people that information and what it is they need to do with it. Because, you know, just giving people a legal form, I don't know, I've signed you from time to time to work on those and pull those forms. And when you get into them, you realize, like, some of that's not straightforward, right? There are things you need to know about how to file that form. It kind of relates to, it reminds me a lot of tax forms. You go and you know, we used to, in old days, we used to go to the library and get the tax book. Like, I gotta go to the library and get that tax book. Nowadays you don't do that. It's all on the internet. But you would go and you get the tax form, and that's fine and everything. And they're not particularly hard if you file like a 1040 easy, right? There's a reason it's called the easy form. It's easy, right? But there's some things that'll still confuse you, or maybe you like, I don't know what that's asking for there. Well, that's true with all these legal forms that are available too. So that's the point of the project. You know, I wouldn't say that you can't confer with each other about what it is that you think you should put in there, but it should be your own work at the same point. So, you know, I certainly don't want to see everyone's look exactly the same. It should be nice to read and easy to look at, right? I mean, that's not only is the content of your work important, but so is the way it appears. Because if something's not easy to read or doesn't look nice, it's discredited. And whether you like that or not, you can have the greatest writing in the history of the world, but if you did it in crayon, it isn't going to get as much acceptance. You know, we commonly joke about that, right? Like, oh, you know, I'm going to write that in crayon, so nobody, you know, believes me. You know, it's because that's the way we look at it. That is true. So keep that in mind. All right. Any questions about that? No? If you do, or when you do, let me know and we'll talk about that. If you have a question that I feel like is common to the class, I'll make sure I email it back out, or we talk about it here. But as you dig into that a little bit more, take a look. Okay, any questions? All right, so let's move on into today's chapter. Really is a lot related to kids and their rights. And so this chapter, the first part is about illegitimacy and paternity. We've kind of talked about legitimacy a lot before because it's kind of an interesting subject, and especially what it was called at one time. But how kind of irrelevant it is today is kind of an interesting point. It's kind of irrelevant in most of the law than it might have been at one time. But illegitimacy and paternity are very closely related. And then the next one is about, you know, the legal rights of children and what they have, you know, what they can get and they can't get and stuff like that under the law. So first of all, you know this probably. What is a legitimate child? What is a legitimate child? It says it right there. Right. Their parents are married. That's like all it comes down to. All right. An illegitimate child is one born to parents that are not married, right? That's pretty simple. We know them as different things, non-marital children. At common law, we actually said they were the child of no one, right? In the old days, they were no one's child. What the heck did that mean? Why would we obviously know they were not the child of no one, right? They were born to a woman, right? Why was the child not the woman's child?
Ownership, property.
Women didn't have full legal rights themselves, right? And if they were married, we know what was that concept that we knew? Unity of person, right? So if you were married, well, you didn't have your own rights, and if it wasn't your husband's child, right? Child of no one now, right? Kind of confusing, but that's what filius nullius meant. And you're the child of no one. And literally in common law, it said you couldn't do certain jobs. You can't do certain jobs. That's feudal, right? You understand that goes back in history. We're talking about has to do with the lords of the manor and all those things, and you weren't entitled to it. You only got certain jobs. That's kind of weird. But probably more importantly is you were not entitled to the support of the father. So that person was never going to necessarily accept you as their kid, and you weren't entitled to any child support, whatever that meant at different times. We know it differently probably in terms of what, because it's more clearly defined today. But you were not entitled to support of the father. You were not entitled to live in the home and all those kinds of things. I always think back, I don't know why it always goes this way, but when I think of illegitimate children, I always think of Henry VIII. And because he's probably the most famous one that we know how big a deal it was to him, right? About the legitimacy of his children or illegitimacy for thereof, right? And if you pay any attention to that, he had one boy earlier that was clearly his child, but then he married her sister, right? The mom's sister. And you know who that was? Anne Boleyn, right? And everybody loves Anne Boleyn, right? Right? She was the great one. What was wrong with Anne Boleyn? Why does history not like her? I mean, I don't know what was wrong with her, but why does history not like Anne Boleyn? I don't know. Look it up. It's interesting. In any event, he had a child with her sister, right? And wasn't his kid. Okay, that's the idea at common law. Well, you didn't get royal rights and all that stuff. And anyway, we've talked all about this before. Okay, so you all understand this concept and how it's really not a huge factor anymore. We do see it in certain circumstances that it relates more about when we talk about support and those kinds of things. We see that. Intestate succession, let's mention that just briefly, but what do you think that means, intestate succession? Why is that important to legitimacy? What is intestate succession, first of all? You die without a will, and who generally receives under your property if you die without a will? How's that determined? Let's ask that question first. Your heirs. Okay, who determines who your heirs are? The statutes, right? So if you have no will, the statutes determine your heirs, and then it gives to your heirs. Who are your heirs typically? Your surviving spouse potentially, but certainly your children, grandchildren, and those folks. So why does this have to do with legitimacy? If it's your heirs that inherit from you, right? It makes sense. Inherit. Then what is that relevant to legitimacy and paternity for that matter?
I don't understand what your question is, but your paternity would mean everything could. Do your will, make sure that you work.
Okay, so your answer, you were saying basically the paternity is everything in terms of whether or not you're determined to be an heir, right? Otherwise, you can't inherit through the statute because you were not determined to be the child. That's how it's related. So you answered the question. That's what I was asking is, what does intestate succession, why are we even mentioning it in this area of the law? It's because in order to inherit from someone, you have to be determined to be their heir. And if you're an illegitimate child, you weren't always in the law. And until it's established, how do we know you're the heir, right? So the question that really comes up in this whole area is, do you have to prove paternity prior to the death of the father in order to inherit through intestate succession? Okay, there's a debate there. That's why it says maybe you have to. Historically, did you have to prove that that person was your father before they died in order to inherit in history? Yes. Because why? How would you prove it after?
Right.
Right? Even with DNA testing and all those things, isn't it hard to go back in time and go figure that out today? Yeah. Actually, not as much today as it once was, right? I think they dug up Thomas Jefferson not too long ago, didn't they? Figure out, remember that? Lady in California was his child or not, or his great-great-grandchild or whatever. We can still do that from time to time. That's kind of wild, but anyway, you get the idea. You had to pretty much prove it because actually it was all based on testimony, right? It wasn't going to be based on blood or those kinds of testing. It was based on testimony. So maybe you have to prove it before the person dies, but today, do you think you still have to? No, because you can have scientific proof to some level. It's not 100%, right? 99.99% you're the father, right? In this area, I already told you my joke about the Everyday's Father's Day billboard. You hear me telling you about that? I didn't tell you guys that story about Everyday's Father's Day. When I was in law school, we learned this stuff. But on my way home from law school, and I was driving, there was this big billboard, and Maury Povich's show was always about paternity tests, right? I don't know if you ever saw Maury's show, but there was this huge billboard that just said "Every day is Father's Day." It was Maury. It was like Maury, it's like the Maury show, and I just thought that was hilarious. Like every day is Father's Day. Yeah, that's right. So that was his shtick for a while, right? Anyway, moving on into intestate succession, but how does it relate to will interpretation? And a lot of times in wills today, we try to write them and specifically identify our children by name and say, this is the person we want to inherit in our will. Sometimes we didn't always do that. We would say, it's our children, I give equally to my children. Today's world, we would say to my children, we name them, but then to my grandchildren equally or something. And those, we have to define who those were. So that's the will interpretation part. Are the kids that were not determined to be legitimate yet, maybe, before that person died, if they hadn't been proven then, now they died, are they the grandchildren that person met when they wrote the will? Right? Those start to be complicated questions. Just throwing that out to you so you understand. Okay, any question about that? A couple of areas that we have to look at is we do know that legitimacy is irrelevant now about whether or not there's child support is owed. A illegitimate child can seek wrongful death damages in a civil suit. They can receive benefits through the workers' comp statutes as surviving or as related children, okay? Social Security, one of the big things that we have, the question about it is the non-marital, they have to prove that they were dependent. That's what Social Security says, because that Social Security's rule about whether or not a child can get support from a disabled or a retired parent has to do with whether or not they're dependent upon the person, okay? Then there's an interesting question is, can you get these Social Security benefits, survivor benefits, for instance, if you're conceived after the death? Okay. How do you get conceived after death? Somebody's excited about that. A miracle. Yes, it's a miracle of science. Well, how does it happen? Artificially, right? We hear of that happening. It's happening more and more often where people are then, storing and then conceiving after death. Well, is that really the intent of the Social Security statutes and the law there? That you should get the survivor benefits in that case? When you're not really the survivor of the person, you clearly weren't dependent upon that person during your life, right? Kind of interesting questions, right? We do know basically that we're not, let's say we go off the conception part and we say you were born after death. That makes sense to us, right? Because that's not, there's a 9-month period that we're aware of and all that stuff. Okay? That makes sense? Okay. Talking about immigration and whether or not the father can bring children in through immigration. they have to specifically prove paternity, or they have to institute a legitimation proceeding. Okay, what does that mean? There's lots of things that mean. We'll talk about that in a minute. But immigration, the father, like you can get children's rights under the immigration law. You know that if you have a U.S. father, then you can be a citizen and all that kind of stuff. It has to be proven that it's actually your kid, basically. It's important to the immigration statute. Okay. Let's talk a little bit then about artificial insemination. And this is where science changes the rules a little bit. Because the biological father is now maybe knowingly not the husband, okay? And that's the question. So who is the father of a child born in a marriage through artificial insemination? Well, the law says that's basically clearly the paternity. It's clear paternity of the husband. Why? Because you've agreed. That's the contractual right. There are statutes that allow you to do that, and you can create that parentage link. Okay, it's hidden at the bottom. Okay, sperm donors. Do sperm donors become the parent of the child? No. Why not? So it says no. You get no parental rights or duties. Okay, so no. But why? Why don't they get that? There's a movie with Vince Vaughn in it about that, right? One day he finds out he's the dad of like 150 kids, right? Well, why don't you get parental rights or duties?
Are they usually anonymous?
Typically, you have an anonymous number or something. You have that. Yeah, so that's a good reason. Why do we, doesn't it make sense that you would, you would become the parent? I mean, that's what science says. You're biologically the parent. Right? The law just has to change what's logical on that part, right? The law has to change the biological part and say, that's not the purpose. Do sperm banks have a valid purpose? They do, right? Totally valid purpose. So we want to allow those things, so the law has allowed those things. Okay, what if you donate sperm in the traditional way? Are you the father? Yes, right? What does that mean? Okay, so I think I gave you an example of a couple years ago. There was a lesbian couple in Tennessee, and I think it was Tennessee, and they had made a deal with this guy that they didn't want to go through the expense of artificial insemination. So they just made a deal with him, and they said, okay, you're going to impregnate one of us, and it's our kid, and we'll make a contract. You don't have any parental rights. You don't have any parental duties. It's our kid. We won't tell anybody, right? Okay? And so it happens. And they do it the traditional way. They don't go to the sperm bank. They just do it the way we know it happens, right? And now the kid's born. Life's going along well for a while. He's not the father, right? He's like, clearly I am, but I'm over here, and I made a deal, and they paid me. I think they did pay him some amount of money, or maybe he didn't. Who knows? And he's over there going along. Well, what do you think happened to make this news? Government found out, right? Well, whose kid is this? Why do you think? How did the government find out? Seems like what you do in private's your business, right? You get this kid, whatever, move on. What do you think happened to get the government involved? They did. They applied for government benefits, and the government says, well, who is the father? Because that's what they do. But the child support enforcement agencies, you know what they do is when they pay government benefits, they want to get the right to go get support from the parents. So that's what they do. And they're like, well, who's the parent? And they said, oh, no, we did it this way. We made an arrangement. And they said, okay, well, show us your, doctor's records that you did it the legal way. And they can't because all they have is an agreement they made between themselves. So the government says, okay, well, then he's the father. That's the way this works. You donate in the traditional manner, you're the parent. So they're trying to get him for child support. And he's like, well, I'd have never done it if that was the case, right? He's like, well, crap. So they file the whole case and they fight the case out. And what it comes out is like, if you don't follow the law's method for doing this, then you don't get the common sense rule of the biology. You don't get to throw that out and use the legal way. You have to follow the prescribed manner in the law. Okay? Do you think that's a fair result? Does that make sense? We allow this to happen, don't we? We allow there to be artificial insemination using a donor, an anonymous donor sometimes, and sometimes a known donor, right? We allow there to be known donors. You'll see it from time to time that it's a brother or a cousin or something because you're wanting to keep the same basic genes or whatever, right? We allow that to be done, a known donor. Does that person become the father? While you think about that, I remember there was this one Maury, because I used to watch it occasionally too. There was this one Maury, and they were convinced this guy had a twin brother, and he was convinced that his girlfriend had cheated on him with his brother, okay? And they did the paternity test, and it turns out that the kid of a twin has the same DNA test result. And so it was like, they thought it was like, he's like, turns out you are the father to like the brother. And the guy's like, you suck. And they're yelling and everything. And then they're like, then like after that all explodes, Maury's like, wait, we got an expert opinion. And they're like, you know that the kid of a twin is still the same, you know, the same test result. It was just kind of funny. So then they had to do a lie detector. Anyway, this stuff's good stuff. This is true life. All right, anyway, watch some of those. They're really good. I don't know, is he still even on?
Yeah.
He is on still? Does he still do all that DNA stuff? Anyway, that one was really good. I like that one because they were just really mad. I knew it. You suck. Okay, so I asked you a question. I forget what it was, but answer it now. What was it? Oh, it's like, why does it let you do? Why does the law make you do it the way the law does it? Does that even make sense?
I don't know nothing about that case.
You don't think? You don't think he should? I mean, you think it was a bad idea to begin with?
Obviously.
Well, hindsight's 20/20. It sounded like a good deal.
What's the point?
I buy you dinner. Sounds pretty normal, actually, doesn't it? I buy you dinner. It sounds about the same, actually. I can't think. What do you mean it doesn't make sense? I buy you dinner, bada bing, bada boom, right? Go ahead. I'm sorry, I have to be funny, but you don't think it was a good idea?
No.
But we do that. We allow it to happen in this other realm. We let doctors and these banks make money on this, right? I don't even know if they can. Maybe they don't make money.
Get away with it that way because they can't tax it and stuff.
So government wants in on it. That's why. So should government just get out of this? Probably not, right? They probably have to stay involved. Well, anybody have an opinion? Should that mean that you, just because you donated in the traditional and cheaper way, right, you shouldn't get the protections of the law about artificial insemination and things like that? Like, I don't get it, right? That's what I'm asking. I don't know. Think about that some more, I suppose.
If we had an agreement, why would it be considered enough to?
Oh, so the question is, if they had an agreement, they wrote it up between themselves, why is it not good? Why doesn't that hold up? That's a good question. Okay, you have it notarized, that always makes it better.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
You still can't have a valid contract with illegal activity.
Oh, you might have some illegality, right?
The nature
You're
of being-
selling something for something. You're giving consideration for something that you can't give consideration for, except in some states. But not in Vegas, it's outside the limit. I know that's the part. Is the agreement even valid? It sounds like we allow it to be valid over here, right? But traditional contract rules say it's not valid because you can't have an illegal purpose. But we've determined in the law that, and if you do it this way, it's a legal purpose, right? That's what we've determined. You can't pick and choose what government benefit you get or what law benefit you get. You only get one. If you do all these things, you get the benefit of the law. If you don't get it. Right? That's a valid argument, isn't it? Don't you think a lot of people would start signing off like, oh yeah, I agree not to give you child support anymore, and I'm not going to see the kid anymore. I'll leave you alone, right? A lot of people would do that, wouldn't they? This is different. This was a legitimate purpose. They knew they had a good reason, right?
I don't know about all that now.
Maybe they didn't have a good reason, but they wanted to have a kid.
They got one.
All three of them did, right? Okay. But why can't, it's not different though, isn't it? Couldn't I use this same law and be like, oh, that was a deal we made? I can't find that agreement around here anywhere, but I know that was a deal we made. I wasn't going to pay child support. That wasn't the deal. Wait, can parents do that? Can parents agree to that? Why not? It's the child's support, not the parent's support, right? And parents can't waive the child's support. Makes sense, doesn't it? But we didn't think about it that way. We were just thinking about this arrangement. It's a good deal. As long as we're all on the up and up. Okay, I don't know if we are, but maybe if we are.
Kind of like an adoption. I mean, it's two ladies were taking a child raised and he was
Right?
an adoption, this person that had created this child, doesn't have to pay child support.
If there's a formal adoption, right? But they hadn't done a formal adoption. Maybe that was their workaround. But as soon as they ask for government benefits, is then the government's like, well, we're still going to get back because the state says the law generally says you can go back at least 36 months and get support for 36 months. Okay. I don't know if you know that part. That's just the part I happen to know. But if you are determined to be the father after 36 months, then you can they can take you back either to the birth or 36 months, whatever's longer. Or whatever shorter, I guess. That makes sense? So you can be taken back. So that would be part of the thing. Now you got to pay 3 years worth of child support. Right? I mean, okay, so that's fine. But guess what, anyway, you see there's some potential for issue here. Okay, what about the concept of accidental incest? I hadn't thought about that. What happens if you ended up marrying your sister or your brother, right? Biologically, you didn't know it. Okay, mind blown. Let's leave that off the table for today's conversation. It's not 5 yet. Or is it noon? I forget. Okay. That's crazy though, isn't it? Imagine that. Oops.
no books about it.
Yeah, it is.
No. You should know this before you get into it.
Okay. All right. I suppose. Okay. So how the next thing is the whole process we would probably call generally paternity, but it's also legitimation. You can legitimate, okay, a kid, your child, without going through a whole paternity proceeding. And there are certain ways it's automatic, basically, and that is those are listed here. Acknowledgement basically is when you publicly acknowledge it's your kid, you've pretty much legitimated that kid. Okay. The other way is like if the child's conceived and even born before the marriage, but then the parents marry each other, it's automatic. Okay? There's the combination of saying it publicly and marrying the child. There's something known as a legitimation proceeding, which we don't really have in West Virginia because it's just a paternity. You may as well put it all together in paternity action. You have legitimation by birth. Okay, you're born into a marriage. That was an obvious one, right? You're legitimate if you're born in the marriage. However, you could be illegitimate, right, and born in the marriage. How's that? Husband's not dad, but born in the marriage. Right? By the way, what is a public acknowledgement that you are the father of a child? How's that done? You're on the birth certificate. Okay?
You can move 900 cars won't work.
Do what? I didn't catch it. I'll move on. Okay, you got that? Legitimation by birth. So you got the idea that you could actually have, but we do know the law says that a child born inside of a marriage is automatically legitimate and the husband is the father. Okay? You know that, right? It's an automatic. Okay, then there's a question of what happens if a marriage is annulled? Is the child still legitimate? So let's say the child now is some age and we annul the marriage after several years. Annulled marriage means what? It never existed. So are you still legitimate? Sure. Why? The law says so. They just made a new law and said, yeah, that doesn't make any sense to say you're not. Well, who cares, right? All right, moving on. Paternity actions, that's something that we do. How do we presume? How do we determine paternity? There's actually, every state pretty much has a way to establish that. Usually we do it by DNA testing today. But before the person is determined to be the actual father, they're called the putative father, okay? And in some cases, we can have multiple. By the way, the key word for today is putative, okay? Putative is the name. That means the one, maybe presumptive is another way to say putative father. It's the person we believe to be the father or who's asserting that they are. In some cases, we can actually have more than one putative father. How? How do we have more than one putative father? Someone who claims that they are legitimately, but they're not. How can we have more than one putative father? Good question. We'll move on. You have to bring a paternity action before the child turns to age 18. You can still prove you're the parent after age 18, but for legal purposes, it's kind of irrelevant. You have to bring it before that. And a lot of times in the old days, they used to have, and we still see it from time to time, there's a defense known as non-access to the mother. Okay, what do you think that means? Non-access to the mother. Okay, not allowed, but that's one way, certainly. Another way is what? I wasn't there 9 months ago. I was in another part of the world. I was in prison, right? I mean, there's different ways. You get that? I had non-access. It can't be mine. I know that's my wife, and she's pregnant, but I had no access. Weird way of putting it, actually. So what they did is they come up with a rule known as the Lord Mansfield rule at some time. Actually, it's undone now. But Lord Mansfield's rule said you can't claim that. It's still your kid. You can't make that argument. Today you can make that argument. Okay, got that? Presumption of legitimacy means that if the child's born in a marriage or your name's on birth certificate, that you presume to be legitimate and that you're the parent. Okay, presumption of paternity, the same deal. You acknowledge it, you consent to the name on the birth certificate, you receive the child into the home and hold out to the world as your own. Remember, I gave you a case about that subject, right? Where the guy was saying, you know, basically, we determined he was the father. Why did we do that?
Because we waited so long before he decided he wasn't.
Right. He decided too long later that he didn't want to be, right? Even though he knew he wasn't. He knew by fact, okay, that he wasn't. But he held himself out as the father for a period of time. Why did he do that? Because he loved the mother and he loved the child for some period of time, we hope. Okay? Why did he do it? That's why he did it. So we said that, well, you're the presumed father now. What did we say in that case we wouldn't allow? We wouldn't allow him to do something, right? What was the legal term for that?
You wouldn't allow him to disestablish his paternity.
Right, we wouldn't allow him to disestablish paternity. I think it's a funny way of saying it, because what we're talking about is the difference between factual paternity and legal paternity, right? That's what we mean. We're not allowing you to disestablish legal paternity. We know factually you're not, but legally we won't let you. Kind of interesting point. Obligated, you know, basically once you're the parent, you have the obligation to pay support the child. And I already mentioned briefly that we have, how can we have a situation with more than one putative father? Well, how is through the conflicting presumptions, right? So I'm going to buzz back up a second. The conflicting presumptions are what? You're married to the mother. You acknowledge paternity. You consent to name on the birth certificate, or you receive the child in the home and hold out to the world as your own, right? So, okay, an example might be you're married to the mother and someone else acknowledges paternity on the birth certificate. That's an interesting one, isn't it? So you have the presumption that a child born to a marriage is the father, and you have one where the birth certificate says the same thing. You could have more than one putative father. Which one is it? Probably can't be both, right? I suppose stranger things have happened. That make sense? Yes. What are you doing? Okay. How do you prove it? Blood test, DNA. How do you get the right to seek paternity? You know, third parties. Well, basically, you have to have some evidence and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so any questions about illegitimacy and paternity? I mean, we can talk about that. This is long enough, I think, because it's not a particularly pressing issue. Typically, what we have is that the state is the one who's most interested in establishing paternity, and that's because they want to make sure that both the parents are responsible for their child. Okay, they're the ones in the most interest. One of the things that happens in family law cases all over the country, paternity actions are almost always brought by these child support enforcement agencies. In West Virginia, we're known as the Bureau of Child Support Enforcement. In Ohio, that's the CSEA, the Child Support Enforcement Agency. They're the ones who are most interested in bringing these. The other group, probably the second most common, are the fathers who they were not married to the mother when the child was born. They lived together and they have since broken up, but it was never clearly established. Their name wasn't on the birth certificate for whatever reason. They weren't there to do that, and the mother just said, I don't want him on there, or whatever happened. You'll see those from time to time, but you'll see a father who is seeking, who has basically raised the child to a certain age, doesn't even have to be very, very long, who brings a paternity action. And why does that person do that? What is their interest at that point, do you think?
Either getting split custody or getting out of paying child support.
Right. Normally, you don't. You wouldn't even mention it if you can avoid paying child support. They're doing it to get custodial time. So you get it right. They want to split the custody because now the child's being withheld, or you need to set some firm guidelines about it. Okay, because what happens once you set paternity, immediately you can go back 36 months and charge child support. And those get complicated because you have times where the parents have stayed together after the birth, okay? And now 36 months has gone by, and now, so you've provided by being a household member, and then there's an action filed against you. Now you might have to pay 36 months back in child support. Is that fair? Doesn't sound fair, right? Provided you were actually providing it to home or whatever, but you get the concept, I think. Okay, any questions about that? All right, let's talk about the legal status of children. We go through some different subjects here, but basically, you're not a child anymore when you become the age of majority. When is that? Age 18. Okay. However, you can get an adult majority status through the process that's known as emancipation. What is emancipation? It's like divorcing your parents. That's what it is. Okay, so you divorce your parents. Why would you want to divorce your parents? I think a lot of reasons that is. When you're a teenager, it's clear to you, right? There's lots of reasons. But can you be emancipated just with, can you just get emancipated? What do you think is the requirement? What do you need to establish in order to be emancipated?
You have to have your own job, yada, yada, yada.
Right. The concept generally is you have to be able to support yourself. Who are the most common emancipated folks? Where do they come from? What industry? Hollywood, right? They're the ones who want to be emancipated. Or child athletes. A lot of times kids that are good athletes, when they hit a certain age, that's a big one. Why is that? When I was growing up, one of the most famous ones that emancipated himself from his parents was Macaulay Culkin. He went out.
That's what I was thinking of.
Macaulay Culkin.
I think that was a horrible idea.
Yeah, it's gone swimmingly. But why did he do it? What do you remember why he did it? Why he wanted to be emancipated from them? Home Alone. Boom! Because they left him home alone. Not only that, at one time they sent him to New York. Home Alone is Aunt Uncle's. Yeah, he had an expensive habit. I heard the other part, but I'm not going to put it on record. Yes, but why did they do it? Why did he do it? Because he said they were taking his money and spending it on themselves. That was why he did it. And he's like, well, I made the money, they didn't, and they're just wasting it all. And then didn't he get? Yeah, I don't know. He's back out. He's doing better nowadays, I think. Didn't he marry or wasn't he dating Mila Kunis or something for a long time? Not Ashton Kutcher's wife now. I don't know. Anyway, interesting. But that's the guy I think of every time when I think about emancipation. There's been some others, athletes. Sometimes the gymnasts after Olympics, I've seen a couple of them do that. They come out because they do those tours and they make money and all that stuff, and their parents trying to, I don't know. Anyway.
Now, what about that girl that just got famous not too long ago on Dr. Phil? I have a feeling she's going to pull the same stuff as Macaulay Culkin.
Yeah, I don't know the story. What did she
She's
do?
the Catch Me Outside. How about that girl?
Okay, yeah.
Like, she's making a crap load of money because of that. And
Yeah.
It's stupid.
yeah.
And so is like 80% of American population.
So yeah, she probably will cash in and then be worried about people taking it, right? That's a big reason. That's not really the intent. Isn't just to, the intent isn't just for rich kids to be able, people making big money that way to go on their own. The big intent is that, your parents aren't really supporting you, and you're doing it yourself, and so you should be emancipated. It can help you if you were interested in student loans or student aid. The longer you're emancipated, then you don't have to count your parents' income in terms of what you're eligible for and some of those kind of things. This depends. I mean, you're not going to see tons of these really, because they're complicated, and not most under 18-year-old kids can afford to be out on their own totally. It's just not reality. There are also other support networks. You can move out. You can be removed from the home if there's some abuse, neglect. Laws protect a lot of those kinds of things. So you're potentially due. So you can use that part of the system as opposed to doing it all on your own. So you're just not going to see that very often. The whole point is that before you're age 18, you can't enter into your own contracts. You have no right to enter into a contract, basically, because when you enter a contract with an adult, all you've done is entered an avoidable contract. An avoidable contract is what? You remember this? What's a voidable contract? What's a minor contract? What can happen? It is valid, but the kid is forever allowed to say it's not a good contract. Okay, the classic example that you'll hear is that this is in the old law. Is the kid, a 16-year-old, goes to the car dealer, buys a car, and enters into a contract to buy the car. Then they drive it off the lot and title it around a phone pole, and then they call the dealer and say, "I disaffirm that contract. Come pick up your car." And the law says that they had to give all the money back, and the child returns the car in its state, current state, not the one that it should have been in or that it was in when it left the lot. Okay, is that a fair result to the adult? No. So that's the idea, is you shouldn't enter contracts with minors. So what do the car dealers do today? They don't let you do that because they require a cosigner on that contract who is of age, because that way they can hold you responsible for the damage. But an emancipated child, remember, this is someone who's already supporting themselves. How do they go buy their house? Or their rent? How do they sign a lease? That nobody's going to give them one, right? If I'm under 18, they're not really going to give me a lease because I can void it anytime I want as the kid, right? So emancipation gives you that legal right back to enter into contracts, to hold real property, things like that, okay? That's important to you, right? Because otherwise, how do you fully support yourself? The old rules even said essentially that you couldn't buy groceries because the grocer couldn't enter a deal with you. Okay, so we opened the door on that, and we said that you could have necessaries, and kids can enter into contracts for necessaries. What's that mean? Food, rent, sometimes car payments, some of those things, but those just muddy the waters, and still no one will give it to you basically unless you have some kind of cosigner. Okay, got that? Property and earnings, you are allowed to earn your own money when you're under the age 18. That's the law. There's lots of child actors, for instance. We know they do it. And certain, we obviously know, I think probably a lot of us have worked when we were under the age 18. You're obviously entitled to make money and keep it for yourself. That makes sense. But you're also allowed to hold real property in your own name and for personal property. So you're allowed to buy a car. You're allowed to do those things and have it titled in your name. Like you can have a car titled in your name. You can have a house titled in your name. The problem is you can't do anything with it when you're under age 18 because you still can enter only voidable contracts, and no one wants to enter one like that. So what we have, and another big example of personal property, is like holding a stock brokerage account or a mutual fund or something like that. So what we have in the law is, how do we protect so people actually enter into those deals? We have what are known as UTMA laws. Okay, ever heard of a UTMA law? Uniform Transfer to Minors Act. Okay, what the Uniform Transfer to Minors Act say, basically in every state that pretty much they've all passed it, is that you can give money and stuff to kids by law, and you put it into a UTMA account. And the reason you do that is so that the adult can enter and make arrangements for that, and they're basically holding it in trust until they reach the age of majority. The age of majority in those is typically 21, though. So they altered the rule a little bit to give it that little bit more protection. Why? Because we don't trust ourselves at 18. Right? my old joke is that I know what I did when I was 18 to 21 or to 25 when I had no money. So imagine if you had a few bucks, right? So that's always the old thing. It's like a trust. It creates this law that protects people so that they will enter into those kind of deals. Commonly, you'll see that that grandparents or parents have given money to their kids that, they bought a stock for them. Like my stepdad, he gave all his grandkids like $1,000 in Disney stock when he was sick. And he did that in UTMA accounts. Who is in charge of all that money? Right now it's me for my kids, because that's who is put in it under that law. Okay. So I hold it, I make all the decisions because my kids are under age 10 for that matter. What are they going to know? So you just get the idea, right? That makes sense. You're allowed to do it, and by the way, just because I'm holding it doesn't mean it's mine. It means it's theirs. I can't steal it. If I take it and use it for my own use, that's against the law. And I violated fiduciary duty, which says that I have the right, I'm holding it in trust for someone else, which is unethical and illegal and all those things, and I can be sued for it. I'm not allowed to take somebody else's money, right? Okay, domicile, that's less important. You have a requirement of education. What's your requirement of education? You have compulsory attendance in every state until at least a certain age. It varies slightly. Typically, it's around age 16 that you can then, your compulsory attendance at school is required, and then it goes away, right? You know that you can drop out at a certain age, and by law, before that, you're required to go. And if you are not attending school and you're required to, you're known as a truant, right? You ever heard that term? Truancy, right? Truancy means you don't come to work enough, or work enough. That's true too, but school I meant. You don't go to school. And actually, I don't know if you know this, but if a child below the age, I think it's below 7th grade, isn't attending school, it's actually a crime that the parent is committing. Okay, so kids in elementary school, in other words, if they aren't attending school, it's a crime that the parent is committing. They are committing the crime of truancy. After that age, the child becomes the one that's committing truancy. All right, interesting, isn't it? So that makes sense, doesn't it? I hope it makes sense to you that a child that's in elementary school, they can't be determining whether or not they go to school. It's the parent's responsibility. After that point, usually the parents start losing a little bit of that authority because the kids are enough independent they do it on their own. You can do everything you want and they won't go. So what happens, in other words, is that below 7th grade, the parents end up both potentially criminal. They don't usually end up as their misdemeanors in West Virginia. You usually don't end up as misdemeanors. They usually end up in abuse and neglect cases. Okay, so now they are neglecting the child by not requiring the child to go to school when they were compulsorily compelled to be there. After that age, and really in the middle school age, you'll a lot of times not see a criminal case at all. You'll see, and it's still an abuse and neglect case in some cases, where the parent is not doing their part, but sometimes the state will file a specific truancy case against child, okay, where the child then is taken into state custody more or less because they're not taking classes. They're not in school like they're supposed to be. And clearly in high school, up until the age that you're compulsorily required to attend, the state then files those cases against the child. They're their own juvenile delinquency cases. Actually, we know them in West Virginia as juvenile status cases. Status cases, right? Is that familiar? Ever heard of a juvenile status case, right? Probably seen a few of them, William.
Yeah.
And delinquency when you get with the what you call it, public defender's office. There's a decent amount of both of those.
Yeah, I saw a few of them.
And what those are actually cases against the child, okay, that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. We'll hit that again in a minute when it comes to the difference between what they get and don't get. Corporal punishment, that's like, paddling and spanking at school. The law is that the school is in loco parentis. That means basically that they are in the shoes of the parent. So if the parent can spank you, so can the school, right? That's not particularly popular in most states anymore. And most public schools will not do that. Some private schools still do. I don't know if you knew that. It's the problem. There's some problems there that we know about over time. You know, I remember the old paddle in my elementary school, and it was like had the holes drilled into it, and it had the grease marks from the hands on it. You probably never had it. That was like they hung it. They didn't use it anymore when I was in school, by the way. But the principal kept it in his office. I remember it because you go in, you'd be like, oh man. But it had like the, you know, where like the oils from the hand had like darkened the wood. You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. You all didn't have those at your school? You lucky? We heard that it was used, but we didn't have it confirmed. Children still have constitutional rights when they're young. They just have them to a lesser extent than adults. For instance, they have the right of First Amendment in school only to a limited area. You remember the case, if you remember from one of our classes, the Bong Hits for Jesus case? That's the First Amendment in the school thing. Whether or not you can outlaw that kind of a t-shirt, right, during the parade, you can't outlaw that because that doesn't serve a good public interest, right, to encourage bong hits at school, so you can outlaw those kind of things, right?
I've been noticing that you can't even wear pro-Second Amendment stuff to schools anymore. At least in, yeah, in like primary school and secondary.
Really? So, but they can restrict those. They can certainly restrict those rights to children because there's a certain level of order that can be maintained in school. So you don't have your outright First Amendment as a child. Search and seizure law, they're under the Fourth Amendment. This is a hard one. This usually comes up when it comes to the random drug screens or those things where they come into the school and they bring the drug dogs in and try to find drugs in the lockers and some of that kind of stuff. It's not probable cause like it is if you're an adult. If they have reasonable suspicion that there's a kid on campus has that, they can search their locker and their personal belongings on campus. So it's a lower constitutional right than you get as an adult, right? So just as a point information, they can search your private property at school. So that's one of the things that you'll see less of. You also have that relates to, like drug screens for sports and stuff like that. A lot that's search and seizure, whether or not you can be required to do that. That does serve a good public purpose, the drug screens for sports. So that you're not, there's not like reasonable suspicions. All it has to be. Actually, you can do it random because you get a privilege. If you're going to be suspended or expelled, you get the right to due process. What does that mean? You get the hearing and an opportunity to be heard, right? Notice that you're going to be expelled and you get an opportunity to be heard. That's all you get. That's pretty much, it's a pretty minimal due process that's required. If they're going to kick you out, they can. Okay, any questions about that? Child abuse and neglect. You have the right not to be abused and neglect, so the state protects you, right? That's what parens patriae means, that the state has a duty to protect you as your parent. And so that's what the abuse and neglect laws are all about. If you ever wondered, I'm trying to give you the idea, the concept that's involved here, that parens patriae says the state has to protect you as your parent if your parents aren't, okay? And that's what abuse and neglect is all about. So we have a lot of abuse and neglect children in the state of West Virginia. We're at all-time highs right now. It really is bad. And a lot of it has to do with drug use and addictions and things. We always will have some level of that, even highs and lows. Like we typically see highs and lows. We thought we were at highs about 3 years ago, and we just keep going higher. By the way, I don't know if you know that, but we are. And these are confidential cases. This is when the state comes in and takes your kids. CPS is involved and all that stuff. You guys didn't do a lot of that stuff, did you? And public defender, you don't do abuse and neglect. Related cases probably, but not the abuse and neglect.
Yeah, they did related cases.
The criminal side of them, but not the abuse and neglect case. But you get those. That's the whole point of that is that you get due process rights because you have a fundamental constitutional right to parent your children, so that when the state goes to take it away, they don't have this really crazy high standard, but you have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that abuse or neglect has occurred. And then there's all these proceedings that all comes down in different ways. There are a lot of people have the responsibility to mandatory report known abuse and neglect. Lawyers don't have that, but college professors do. I always think I'm in a weird spot there. But because I can get disbarred, I'm going to go with the fact that I'm not a mandatory reporter. But a lot of people are. If you're aware of it, you pretty much have some duty to report. There are a lot of people, nurses, doctors. If I know that you're going to be injured going forward as a lawyer, I have to report it. Like if I know that there's a, you know this from ethical law. If I have ethical rules that if I know that it's going to an impending, I have to report it. Those kinds of things. But a lot of people have those, and you can actually lose licensed social workers, psychologists, and therapists, and all those people. They're mandatory reporters. Safe haven laws relate to when the cases are when a lot of times they're teenagers have a child and they leave them in dumpsters and trash cans and things because they don't want there's an issue there. And safe haven laws basically are that fire departments, police departments, and hospitals have to accept the baby with no questions asked. Okay, what's the purpose for that?
Is better than the alternative.
Absolutely. So that's the idea. The law says we won't prosecute you for that because we want you to turn the child in safety, not put it in a dumpster. I mean, that's the whole concept, right? And that's what the safe haven laws are doing, to encourage people. I remember that when I was in law school in Columbus, they would have a lot of times you'd hear what you said in the news, and it's like they'd hear a baby crying, and it was like, I'm surprised how often that happens. Like, anyway, you get the idea. There's a lot of pressure, especially if you were a teenager and all that kind of stuff. But they want to protect the child. That's the idea. Again, parens patriae. The state should protect you first, and then worry about the other parts. Okay. Lastly, so we can wrap it up, there are two main types of juvenile cases that are basically filed against a juvenile. A delinquency case is one in which basically if you were an adult, it would be a crime. That's what a juvenile delinquency case is. Okay, what does that mean? It means that we are going to prosecute you in a way, but we call it adjudicate, and we don't charge you with a crime. We don't indict you, but we file information type things. But it's a delinquency case. Typically what that means is that you're not going to go to prison. You're going to go into Department of Juvenile Services, or you're going to go, when I was growing up, you went to Salem, right? That was the place, the industrial school for boys, right? There were different places like that all over the state. Juvie, we know it. That's basically juvenile detention. It's prison for kids. It's different. There tends to be a little bit more programming and things like that because the state can only keep custody until age, I think they can go up to age 21. And keep you as a juvenile until age 21. In the law, we say that delinquency, if you're below the age of 7, you can't commit a crime. That if you're between 7 and 14, we have a rebuttable presumption of no crime, which basically means that we're saying you can't commit crime until you're age 14. But if it looks like something that you knew and were responsible for, you intentionally committed it, we can say it was a crime, basically. And over age 14, we can try you as an adult. We try not to, though, okay? Because it's not usually good. Can you imagine if you're 15 and you commit a crime and, you go to prison, or maybe we're going to make you a lifelong prisoner, a criminal. That's not really good. We also have the status offenses, and status offenses are the truancy cases, and the other version of truancy are the incorrigibility. Okay, I remember my grandma calling us incorrigible from time to time. You know what incorrigible means? Basically that you don't listen to your parents or they can't control you. That's the people who sneak out at night and things like that, and they're getting into trouble and they can't keep you in the house no matter how hard they try. The state will file an incorrigibility complaint status case in West Virginia, and they will basically prosecute you for that, and then they'll give you new rules, and you can go because you don't want to stay home. They'll send you to state custody. It's not the parent. The parents are trying. It's they can't keep it under control. So that's what incorrigibility is. Okay, again, keyword, putative. Any questions? All right, that's it for today. See ya.